In this lesson, we'll continue the flight we began in the first Autoflight lesson. We left off cruising along at flight level 250. ATC clears you to flight level 310. To make a cruise climb, first set the altitude in the altitude window. Next, push the altitude selector. Pushing the altitude select changes the FMC cruise altitude to the MCP altitude and initiates the climb. Cruise descents are made in the same way. However, if you are within 50 miles of the top of descent, pushing the altitude selector initiates a descend now. When a descend now is initiated, the airplane descends at approximately 1,250 feet per minute until intercepting the planned descent path. Approaching the top of descent, ATC clears you to 15,000 feet. Again, for any altitude change, first set the MCP altitude window. Upon reaching the FMC top of descent point, the autothrottle reduces thrust to idle. Idle enunciate on the PFD. After thrust reaches idle, the enunciation changes to hold. Pitch maintains the VNAV path. The angle of descent path is calculated by the FMC to maintain the FMC descent speed profile. Like previous Boeing autopilots, the 777 autopilot will not pass through the MCP altitude. If the MCP altitude is reached before the next VNAV altitude, the airplane levels out and the pitch mode engages in VNAV altitude. VNAV remains engaged in what can be considered as a VNAV altitude hold mode. Since remaining level at the MCP altitude affects your ability to recapture the path, let's start a descent. To continue the descent, set the MCP to the next FMC altitude restriction, 10,000 feet, and push the altitude selector. Approaching the next FMC altitude restriction of 10,000 feet, ATC clears us direct to 5,000 feet. You could go to the legs page and delete the 3 altitude restrictions, but a quicker way is to use the altitude selector on the MCP. First, reset the MCP to the new altitude. Next, push the altitude selector. Notice the 10,000-foot restriction at Fillmore was deleted. Now push the altitude selector 2 more times to delete the altitude restriction at Hassa and Denay. Each push of the altitude selector deletes an altitude restriction between the airplane and the MCP altitude. On some Boeing airplanes, the FMC makes idle thrust descents. If an altitude constraint is reached before the waypoint, the airplane levels off. On the 777, the airplane flies a direct path to the next constraint. The autothrottle engages in speed and increases thrust to maintain the descent speed. You are level at 4,000 feet, and ATC clears you to 3,400 feet. Make the descent in vertical speed at 500 feet per minute. With vertical speed engaged, the selected vertical speed bug is displayed. We're now on an intercept heading to the localizer, and ATC just cleared us for the ILS approach. Arm approach. Localizer and glide slope enunciate on the FMA. In this airplane, the FMC automatically sets the frequency and front course for the selected ILS approach. The localizer captures if the track is within 120 degrees of the localizer course. On localizer capture, the inbound heading automatically sets on the MCP. Once the glide slope is captured, you can set the missed approach altitude to 5,000 feet. Once both the localizer and glide slope are captured, the approach mode can only be disengaged by pushing a toga switch, disengaging the autopilot and turning off both flight directors, or, if above 1,500 feet radio altitude, pushing the approach switch a second time. If approach is pushed, the autopilot engages in the following modes. For roll, if bank is greater than 5 degrees, the autopilot engages in attitude hold. If bank is less than 5 degrees, the autopilot engages in heading hold or track hold. For pitch, the autopilot engages in vertical speed or flight path angle. At 1,500 feet radio altitude, the Autoflight system goes through a pre-autoland test. After satisfactorily completing the test, Land 3 enunciates indicating all 3 autopilots are engaged and operating normally for an automatic landing. Rollout and flare also arm at this point. If a crosswind is present, runway alignment occurs between 500 feet and 200 feet radio altitude. Runway alignment is when the airplane changes from a crab to a slip. There is no enunciation when the airplane aligns with the runway. Between 60 and 40 feet radio altitude, flare engages. At 25 feet radio altitude, the autothrottle begins retarding the thrust to idle. About 2 feet radio altitude, rollout engages and the autopilot controls the rudder and the nose wheel steering to keep the airplane on localizer centerline. Selecting reverse thrust disconnects the autothrottle. When disconnected this way, the ICAS message does not display and the caution light does not illuminate. Finally, before turning off the runway, disconnect the autopilot with the disconnect switch on the control wheel and cancel the warning with a second push. Touch the highlighted area. Re-engaging the autopilot or a second push of the disconnect switch are the only ways to cancel both the ICAS message and the oral warning. Now, let's go back to the approach phase of our flight and look at a go-around. Go-around arms when glide slope captures or the flaps are extended. There is no enunciation when go-around arms. Push either toe switch to initiate the go-around. The autothrottle engages in thrust mode. Thrust is set for a 2,000 feet per minute climb. If full go-around thrust is required, simply push either toga switch a second time. When go-around is initiated, the flight directors appear even if the flight director switches are off. Toga enunciates for roll and for pitch. The autopilot controls roll to maintain current track. Pitch controls either the MCP speed or the speed at go-around initiation, whichever is greater. If the airplane exceeds either of these speeds for more than 5 seconds, the current speed becomes the target speed. When above 400 feet, roll and pitch modes are available. Engage LNAV. Now increase airspeed to 220 to retract flaps. engage VNAV. During your go-around, the glide slope went down. ATC now has you on radar vectors for the localizer-only approach. You have just been cleared for the approach, so arm the localizer mode. The MDA for this approach is 460 feet. Set the MDA in the altitude window. While crossing the final approach fix, you recall from the last approach that the glide slope angle was a normal 3 degrees. Select Flight Path Angle with the Vertical Speed Flight Path Angle reference switch. Notice the window changes from vertical speed to flight path angle. Next, engage Flight Path Angle with the Vertical Speed Flight Path Angle switch. The current airplane flight path angle is displayed. Finally, set a -3 degrees flight path angle with the Vertical Speed Flight Path Angle selector. You can monitor the airplane's descent angle with the flight path vector and the selected flight path angle symbols on the PFD. The runway is in sight, and you are cleared to land. Nice approach. This completes the instruction section of this lesson.